This is week 6, audio number 2. We're going on to slide 9. So, to get back to that whole thing about Mao being first among equals and other things that have been said is that the Politburo was a collegial organization where there was open debate. It's true that back in 1954, 1955, someone like Zhou Enlai, the premier, the head of government, also a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, could come to Mao in private and say, you know, this idea you have about very rapid socialization in the countryside of moving forward to higher level agricultural producer cooperatives, I think it's a marvelous idea and it advances socialism very much, but there are a few small problems I would like to bring to your attention. And he could get away with that, but not after 1957. So from Socialism is Good, which is a song you will hear on the soundtrack of Morning Sun. I'm not going to sing it for you, although I am tempted, let me tell you. Those were the days. From Socialism is Good, going on to slide 10, to the East is Red. In other words, from singing the praises of the Communist Party and the new China, the country went to the worship of the emperor, the great man himself. Now this song, The East is Red, which is most identified with the Cultural Revolution, is actually an old peasant song from Shanxi province, the area where Yan'an was, where the communists holed up during World War II. And it was a song about simple life. Things like when the thread runs out, then the clothes become holy, that sort of thing. You know, just very simple things about grain and living in the countryside and the rain and stuff like that. But it was turned into this song in praise of Mao during that period, during World War II. I think it might have been written, given these words anyway, in 1944. And it remained known, but it became very, very popular during the period leading up to the Cultural Revolution, and it was part of that movie or stage show that was made into a movie called The East is Red, that comes at the beginning of that movie, called Morning Sun. Going on to slide 11. That movie, The Morning Sun, was made in 1964, and it indicated that indeed the Mao cult, the worship of Mao's person, his veneration as the most wise and able leader who had ever been, was reaching its height in 1964, and certainly that was part of what gave Mao his self-confidence, that he could wipe away the other revolutionary leaders who had been his colleagues for decades, if he wanted to. There's some controversy over whether Mao really wanted to wipe them away early on like this, in 1964 and 1965. However, one may never know that. The argument that he may not have wanted to necessarily purge everybody around him in 1965 comes from studying his actual activity during the period, and a conclusion has been made by one scholar whom you're reading this week, Frederick Tevis, that he hadn't really decided because he was not making decisive moves. He was putting everything on hold until November of 1965. But the things that happened before that were that in January 1965, Mao issued these 23 articles, which principally were aimed at shifting the focus criticism of Communist Party cadre who had not followed his ideas of permanent revolution, shifting the criticism from the rural cadres to cadres in general, and that meant cadres in the city, and to those in authority, which meant very high-ranking people who are taking the capitalist road. And so in February, this was all still pretty quiet. In Morning Sun, the narrator says that it was in 1966 in May that a year later that the Cultural Revolution moved from the arts page to the front page, which is an interesting way to put it, but anyway. There was never any question that the Cultural Revolution was about art, as far as I have ever been able to tell. There may have been some discussion like that in the public, but I want to dispel the notion that it started off as some sort of real cultural movement. It started off as a political idea in the head of Mao Zedong. So he had this man named Yao Wenyuan, who was a propaganda official and became one of the members of the so-called Gang of Four, write a criticism of a Peking opera that had been written by a man who was a vice mayor of Beijing named Wu Han. Going on to slide 12. So Wu Han had written this opera. It was very popular. It depicted an unwise emperor who dismisses a loyal general, and Mao's wife Jiang Qing and her close associate Kang Sheng. You may remember him. He was the Secret Service chief in Yan'an who carried forth Mao's orders to conduct this really widespread purge called the Salvation Movement. Kang Sheng, also like Jiang Qing, from the same part of Shandong province in the east, and she, at this point, were doing cultural work. And they identified this opera as being a mistaken sort of thing, and possibly critical of Chairman Mao himself. And so they discussed this with Mao, and Mao decided to have Yao Wenyuan write this article. But he held on to it. It took him probably a month or two to write it, but he held on to it until he was ready to actually begin to start to attack officials whom he felt were his enemies. But like anywhere else, you don't just go and attack the top first if you're doing this sort of thing. You attack the underlings first because they're more vulnerable, and by getting rid of them, you are removing the power base of people who can do the bidding of your real enemy. And that's what Mao Zedong did. He prompted these criticisms that followed in early 1966, and not only was Peng Zhen, the mayor of Beijing, removed, but also Luo Ruiqing, who had started off his career as a soldier. He was the Minister of Public Security for the first 9 years of the People's Republic, and he was replaced by Lin Biao in 1959, right after the Lushan plenum, when Peng Dehuai, the head of the military, was replaced. I'm getting it all. I'm saying it wrong. The big thing that happened, as you recall from last week, was in 1959, the Lushan plenum. Peng Dehuai, the defense minister, wrote Mao a letter and said, "Hey, man, all these people are starving in the countryside. We really should do something about it. But you're a wise and great leader." And so he was replaced and attacked, as we discussed last week. And, of course, this is all over your readings. And then Luo Ruiqing was moved from the Ministry of Public Security to be Chief of Staff of the Army, because he was considered by Mao to be a very loyal person. And above him, his boss, the new defense minister, was Lin Biao there. So The problem, the contradiction, the 矛盾, for all you Chinese speakers out there, the contradiction, the 矛盾 between Lin Biao and Mao Zedong on one side and Luo Ruiqing and most of the generals in the army on the other side of this small question was, which part of training should be the most important? Military training, firing range, patrolling, learning to spot artillery rounds, that sort of thing, or political work, the thoughts of Mao Zedong, and so on. And Mao thought that his thought and political training should be more important, as did Lin Biao. Luo Ruiqing was on the other side of that question, and this is why Luo Ruiqing was targeted and disposed of during this period. And so that brings us toward the beginning of the chaotic period of the Cultural Revolution. We'll skip past slide 13 and go to slide 14. And talk now, we started off with broad statements about the Cultural Revolution and got into a few specifics about how it was the ground was prepared. Now we'll do a little bit more at the 10,000 foot level, so to speak, and talk about some general ideas about how the Cultural Revolution first was different from other Chinese political movements. One could say that it borrowed from the ideas of Lenin and the May 4th, 1919 movement, and you wouldn't be wrong to say that. The only thing it really did borrow, though, was the name, Cultural Revolution. Lenin and the May 4th movement wanted to bring bourgeois culture to the workers so that the workers would benefit from the broader culture of civilization and be able to use it for the benefit of wider society instead of for the benefit of the rich. However, Mao Zedong wanted to destroy bourgeois culture as well as destroy traditional culture. He wanted to create a completely new society where loyalty to him and to his ideas was the most important thing. The Cultural Revolution was also similar to some campaigns in the past because it had specific targets, whether they were sparrows or they were old KMT party members or they were corrupt officials, that sort of thing. The thing about the Cultural Revolution, though, was it had a very general set of targets. It had all of the targets that had already been persecuted in the past to start with. All of the old bad guys of the pre-1949 society were targeted. But a lot of other people were targeted too. So it took into its sights the people who had already been struggled against and then released back into society, old KMT members, old landlords, and so on. And it also brought into its sights a much bigger selection of people, and that was not in the least because there was some confusion about how to identify enemies, which we'll get into in a couple more slides. This is a very interesting thing. You've seen, I think, in the films some of the same sort of images. Here they're changing the name of a department store to make it more revolutionary. By the way, you remember that let's see, which slide was it? Slide 2. If you were to take, back there talking about the famine, if you were to take and do just a cut and paste of these of characters, I don't know if you can in what I'm going to be sending out. Maybe I'll try to send it out in the email. If you were to cut and paste these characters and put them into a web browser, then you'd come up with all sorts of gruesome pictures. I'm pointing that out because one of the films that you're seeing this week and that you saw previously in the same series by Philip Short, he says in that film that there were no pictures of the famine, but that's just stupid. There are plenty of pictures of the famine. You can find them on the websites out there in the interwebs if you use Chinese characters. It may be that when he made this film that these pictures were not publicly available on websites. But I know that he doesn't read Chinese, so that may be the other thing about that. Going on to slide 15 now, where it says some major issues of the Cultural Revolution. They included social inequality, which you can read as sort of a debate between two people. You can watch a debate, I mean, in that film, Morning Sun, between a man whose older brother, who must have died, who was the smartest kid in school, couldn't get into college, and he was upset about that, versus another man whose name was Xiaoming, who thought that the system wasn't biased enough because poor people had been kept out of university forever. So there was this inequality, and the inequality had been building since 1949. The people who, when the communists came to the cities at the end of the revolution, there were immediate inequalities between the Communist Party cadre and the people in the newly occupied cities. And it's interesting, the book about Chairman Mao's Doctor by Li Zhisui, that's spelled L-I-Z-H-I-S-U-I, Li Zhisui, Chairman Mao's Doctor. He tells the story in this book of when he first arrived in China in the early 50s. He goes in through Hong Kong, and he has an invitation. He's supposed to be there. But he gets held up in Guangzhou, Canton, on his way north because he naively refuses to hand over like a pack of cigarettes to a cadre, which was always the currency. There was a cadre who said, I can speed up your trip to Beijing if you just happen to bring a little bit of some foreign cigarettes. This is 1955 or something. It's supposedly during the period before there was all this corruption. And so Li Zhisui gets up to Beijing and he talks to Mao and he tells this story, and Mao laughs at him and said, well, why didn't you give him a pack of cigarettes? So Mao may have been complaining about this, but he knew damn well how things were in society. Revisionism. The idea of revisionism is that the Soviets have revised communism. They have made it into something different that we don't like. Part of this was covering up the fact that Mao thought was very different from the writings of Lenin and the writings of Marx. Of course, the big difference was that Mao contended that revolutions should start off in the countryside instead of amongst the workers. And there were other points. But the Soviets by this time were accused of being revisionists. The street that went past the Soviet embassy or that went up to the front gate, I mean, was renamed Revisionist Street. And Mao believed that there were people among the Communist Party members, senior members, who not only were taking the capitalist road, they were taking the Soviet road too. They wanted to have a bureaucratic style of communism that he felt was not in the best interests of ordinary people. So Mao accused these party members of revising Mao thought. This is where the revising, the revisionism comes in, especially to match Soviet priorities. He began criticizing the Soviets in 1961, I think, or 62, as promoting goulash communism. Goulash is a Russian dish, so the idea there is that that their form of communism was intended to bring prosperity to people rather than to clean up their thoughts and make them pure. Who needs a full stomach when you can have so many other things? But anyway, the next interesting issue about the Cultural Revolution is that there were so many different ways to identify enemies, and I don't think I should read through these. You've got them on the thing in front of you, the slide in front of you. The conservative people wanted to target the old KMT. The revolutionaries wanted to target these revisionists in the Communist Party, and the reformists thought that if we can get someone to have the right attitude, then that's fine. They're reformed, and they can be a worker, or they can be an unblemished peasant. Zhou Enlai was a perfect example. He came from a cultured and rich family and decided to become a communist. During the very acrimonious meeting between the Chinese and Soviet leaders in 1959, when Khrushchev visited Beijing, Zhou Enlai had a meeting with him, and Khrushchev made fun of Zhou Enlai and said that you're the only communist I've ever met who so thoroughly betrayed his class, meaning Zhou Enlai's rich and educated family. And Zhou Enlai said, well, it's interesting you should say that, because I think you must feel the same way yourself. Ah, Zhou Enlai. What a card. So another main issue, the last one here, is that Mao's ideas about how to save people ended up coming true. In spite of how thoroughly he condemned his enemies, or his perceived enemies, in the end he had to save 95% of them. In the end he had no choice but to bring under control, to rein in the chaos that he'd started. So let's go into the specific events. Go on to slide 16. I think we'll end here, actually. This audio will go on to audio 3, slide 16.